spring is trying to force its way into the southeast. Old man winter just keeps nudging in. It's transition time for this part of the country. What can we expect for the near term and the next couple months? These answers and more in the March 31st edition of the Water Resources Outlook. Let's start off looking at our past rainfall, and this is the 30-day precipitation departure from normal. And as you can see along the Gulf Coast, in Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi, we have above normal precipitation. As we move a little further north, we've had some rain in the Tombigbee Basin and Alabama Basin flowing further south. And as you get up into Georgia area, we've been a little bit below normal, or slightly below normal for this time of year. And then as we get up into North and South Carolina, again, we go back to above normal, especially along the coast. When we look at the 90-day departure from normal, it shifts a little bit. We've had some good rains in the Swanee Basin and along the Big Bend in Florida. As we get a little further north, one of the things you'll notice is above Lake Lanier and in the Georgia area, we have been below normal over the 90-day period. Now, this is the wet time of year, so we've still had plenty of inflows into the reservoirs, and but we might notice something as we go forward out of the winter and into the spring to see a little differences. As for North Carolina, things are pretty quiet. For the most part over the southeast, especially over the last year, we've been very close to normal, sometimes a little above, sometimes a little below. We've had some flooding, but we haven't gone into drought either, so we've kind of been a little bit back and forth. Now, this is indicated by our 28-day stream flows. As you look over most of the southeast, we have normal stream flow over much of it. The one area that I will mention, we talked about North Georgia and the Chattahoochee River Basin. It has a couple of spots that are just a little bit below normal in that 10 to 24%, but only a couple of spots. Then you also get the top of the Alabama Basin, which actually starts in North Georgia. And so we have a few spots that are a little bit below. Most of those are, again, further north. But for this time of year, we still have good flows in those streams. And what happens over the next month as we transition from a wet period to a little bit dry period during April to the convective season have an impact on what happens this summer. So the U.S. Drought Monitor, again, we see a little bit of dryness. The drought that you see up in northern Alabama is actually out of our area. That's in LMRFC's area. But it is possible that may creep a little further south if we continue to stay dry. Again, we'll have to watch that and see if we do start to get some rains during the springtime period. Again, this is the time when we're starting to dry out just a little bit. But we do have some dryness in a few spots in the southeast. So where are we with respect to flood climatology? Well, it looks like we are actually on our way. We're in week 13, right around week 13, and you can see that we've just barely passed the peak. We still have the opportunity to get some flooding during that time, but we really are kind of past our peak and are looking for kind of things going downhill just a little bit from a flood perspective. That's good news. It'll be quiet for a little while, and then we start to again perk up as we get into hurricane season in June, and then our peak of hurricane season in September, which runs in that 35 to 41 week period. So our normal monthly rainfall by state, the one that you'll notice probably the most is that purple one, or kind of a pinkish purple one. That's Florida, and their wet season will be coming up soon, and so we're transitioning from their dry season to the wet season. And then we're kind of the opposite a little bit in the rest of the southeast, where we have a wet season in much of the southeast through January, February, March, and then we get dry a little bit, and we kind of have a convective season also in the southeast. It doesn't have as much an impact on the rivers just because evapotranspiration rates are so high, and this is where I'm talking about exiting peak recharge season. We're in that time frame, in that April time frame, where our evapotranspiration rates, in other words, the temperatures and the foliage pulling water out of the ground, we're competing for that water now. And so we don't get quite enough rain to share all that water. And so that's when we start to, reservoirs start to come down a little bit, things start to dry out on the ground and so forth. So again, this is the time we start to come out of that, and by the middle of summer, we start to see those deficits creep in. So what is our long-range outlook? Well, here's April through June, and right now, last time I think when we looked at this, we had a few more gauges that showed a long-range flood risk. at least for moderate flooding. We still have some minor chances for minor flooding in some of those places, and we have had some recent rainfall, and there's been a couple of places that have gone into flood, but we've actually backed off that a little bit. We're not expecting as much flooding during this time, but again, with wet conditions over the last year and recent wet conditions in some of the spots that you're seeing, there is still that chance that we could get some heavy rainfall in some of those areas and have some flooding. So here's Jeff to talk a little bit about the weather.
Okay, thanks, Todd. And taking a look at the general weather pattern over the next 10 days or so, we see this week looks like a break from the wet and cold across most of the southeast as surface high pressure anchors itself to the east of the region, allowing for a warm southerly flow and allowing those temperatures to warm up to spring-like values. Through the week, the wet weather will move from the central plains through the Midwest and Great Lakes region into the northeast by the end of the week, and we could see the tail end of this system bringing some thunderstorms to the region by next weekend. This as the jet stream sags south and brings the active weather through the region. We'll have to watch the system closely as there is some uncertainty in how much rainfall we'll get. But looking further out into the next week, the jet shifts with a ridge in the west and troughing in the east, which could spell some slightly cooler weather in the east as well as the southeast, but generally near normal precipitation with this pattern. We don't see any significant weather systems after this coming weekend for a while. And may see a slightly quieter pattern for the first part of April, which really is not uncommon in the southeast for April to begin to quiet down from that active part of the season where we see large-scale storm systems in March. So this would bode well for the flood season, which also typically begins to wane in early April for most of the southeast. So maybe, Todd, just maybe, we are through the winter, early spring flooding for the southeast.
Well, it'd be nice, Jeff, if we were through with the cool too, but hopefully we're at near the end of our flood season. And now I'll look a little bit further out. We continue to talk about ENSO because it's actually interesting now. Now we've been talking about neutral ENSO conditions for the last year, and now we're talking a little bit more about El Nino. And this is our mid-March plume of the ENSO predictions, and as you can see, almost all of the models take us warm the Pacific and take us close to El Nino conditions. Now, this is the El Nino watch. This is the one we showed back in the middle of March, and if I go forward and we see the most recent one, you can see that the red shows El Nino, and it actually is a little bit a better chance for El Nino for that August-September time frame for the end of the hurricane season time frame. Now, in an El Nino year, it tends to dampen hurricanes because of an El Nino. So we'll see what the prediction from the Hurricane Center comes. I have a feeling that it's probably going to be near normal for this year, just because we're in probably a higher activity time period, but with an El Nino, it might dampen things out a little bit. It'll be interesting to see. So here's our 1 month outlook for the month of April, and this is very similar to what we've been looking at in the past. Equal chances for precipitation, above normal, near normal, and below normal. And again, for the 3 month, April, May, and June, it's looking like equal chances. There's nothing to take us one way or the other in this case. And so our bottom line, in the short term, moving into a transition time in the southeast. We've talked about that before. April's kind of a transition time from the wet season to convective season for most of the southeast, but for the Florida peninsula, we're transitioning from dry season to wet season, so kind of the opposite in that way as we move into hurricane season and we get a little bit more active in that area. As for the long term, it looks like near normal conditions as we move through spring and approach tropical season. Again, we've looked at normal for the last year for the most part. We've been a little bit above normal for the rainfall, but it does look like we'll stay near normal for that time as nothing sways us one way or the other, at least until we get to that El Nino maybe later in the fall and going into next winter. We're going to take a little time little bit more time before we do our next water resources outlook. April looks like a pretty quiet month, and we probably won't see that much. However, if something happens, we will be issuing an HVA, a hydrologic vulnerability assessment, or a daily operational overview message to kind of let you know what's going on in case we need an update. Otherwise, we'll look forward to getting you another water resources outlook at the end of the month. Thank you for joining us for today's Water Resources Outlook. You can find more information at our website at www.weather.gov/SERFC. You can also find us on Facebook at the address listed there. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to email me at todd.hamill@noaa.gov.